incredible ocean and a place I'm fortunate to call my office at certain times. My name's Professor Heather Koldewey, based at the Zoological Society of London, and I lead the Bertarelli programme in marine science. So there is only one ocean. It connects and covers over 3/4 of our planet. The ocean's a vibrant, complex ecosystem that sustains human well-being. And increasingly, it's under multiple threats, from overfishing, habitat destruction, pollution, and climate change. And in the face of these threats, marine protected areas are becoming an increasingly important tool to protect and restore species and habitats and build resilience in the face of our ever-changing climate and planet. Now, this isn't just science saying that. This is a global commitment that governments have made through the Convention of Biological Diversity, through the Aichi targets. We've committed to protect 10% of our ocean by 2020. Unfortunately, currently, we're at just over 2% of our ocean is fully protected. And that 10% is a political target. Scientific evidence says we actually need to protect 30% of our ocean if we're going to reverse the adverse impacts we've had to date, if we're going to increase resilience, and if we're going to sustain ocean health into the future. Considering this disconnect, science has an absolutely critical role to build the evidence for how marine protected areas contribute to preserving our ocean and how they need to complement other tools that we have available. So with the vision, ambition, and support of the Bertarelli Foundation and pilot research that we began back in 2013, the Bertarelli programme in marine science was launched in January 2018. It's a 4-year interdisciplinary and collaborative programme. We're more than 70 scientists, many of which who are early career, the next generation of marine scientists. We are biologists, ecologists, geneticists, physicists, geologists, and social scientists working together in a really unique interdisciplinary way, with our focus on one place, this extraordinary ocean wilderness area right in the middle of the Indian Ocean, one of the few places left that are truly a reference point and an ocean observatory. And it's my privilege today to bring together a team of the scientists from the Bertarelli programme in marine science to share some of our latest findings and to give you some of insights into the work we're doing. And importantly, it's not science for science's sake. It's science that matters for both management and policy. So, with me here in Lausanne at the conference today, first of all, is Dr. David Jacoby from the Zoological Society of London.
Hi.
Dr. Dan Bayley from University College London.
Hi there.
And then, with increasing ambition in our connections, first of all, I'd like to take you to Mauritius. And we have Professor Nick Graham and Dr. Casey Benquit from Lancaster University, who are currently attending the West Indian Ocean Marine Science Association conference. And next, the first ever, hopefully, fingers crossed, live link to the Chagos Archipelago and to our scientists who are on Nelson Island, many thousand kilometers away. We have Dr. Nicole Esteban from Swansea University and Dr. Malk Nicol, also from the Zoological Society of London. So this is an absolute first, and if it doesn't go any further, then celebrate this moment. We also have Professor Graham Hayes from Deakin University on Australia on standby, who's a fellow turtle scientist who will be stepping in should the connection fail. Right, so I'm going to start with you, Dave, here in the conference, and your research works on sharks, focuses on sharks. Now, when the Marine Protected Area was established in 2010, it was the first really big marine protected area of its time. But when it was established, that involved closing that area to fishing, and there was a commercial fishery, particularly for tuna, that had a substantial bycatch for sharks and rays. Can you explain how your research since then has given some insights on how that marine protected area works for sharks and what your research has found?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Heather. Sharks globally face significant threats from direct fisheries, but also, as you say, from non-target bycatch fisheries as well. So outside of continental and territorial waters, we see significant declines in reef sharks and pelagic sharks particularly. And actually the high seas fisheries remain largely unmanaged and unregulated. And this is despite the fact that they have significant impact on many of these highly migratory pelagic species of sharks and tuna as well. So as a consequence, we actually see many shark populations globally at a fraction of their historical baseline levels. To try and alleviate some of these pressures, large remote marine protected areas like the BIOT MPA are established to provide a safe haven for some of these animals to reside in. Unfortunately, some of these areas still suffer from illegal fishing activity, and sadly, many of the reef species in BIOT still are faced with these threats. So my research is a collaborative pieces of research with researchers from Stanford University, and we focus on trying to understand the spatial and temporal distribution of reef sharks within the BIOT MPA, to understand how they're moving and how their movements connect using various different tracking technologies. This can be acoustic tracking and also satellite tracking devices as well. I personally use network analysis, which is a methodology for understanding complex interconnected systems, to try and model how sharks move and link different parts of the reef system, the atolls particularly, and what this means for their conservation. And we're getting some interesting results coming through already from that. This research is essentially, it's already revealing that the movement patterns of many of these species are encapsulated within the MPA boundaries, which is encouraging, and also that there are highly dynamic movements between different species, but that also that various species like the silvertip shark are particularly vulnerable to illegal fishing activity, and this is because of the behavioral strategies that they adopt. The research is also helping reveal some of the ecological hotspots and movement corridors that we're seeing, which we're now trying to use to direct the enforcement vessel. We only have one enforcement vessel in BIOT, and we're trying to direct that vessel to the correct locations at the correct times to try and safeguard some of these animals from mass capture, given that they're incredibly slow growing and late to mature. So things are moving on apace, yeah, it's an incredible interdisciplinary program, and we're starting to see actually that it's important also in the context of a changing climate. So in recent years, we've seen 2 successive El Niño warming events, which has had a significant impact on the ecology of the reef as a whole and the communities that it supports. And actually, early indications from our research suggest that we're already beginning to see kind of behavioral responses of some of these reef sharks to these incredibly warming waters. So in the space of 3 years, we've seen increases in temperature of up to 3 degrees in certain areas at certain times of year. And this is meaning that we're simply not seeing the sharks in the places that we once saw them on all of our receiver monitors. So to kind of summarize, this information is crucial for the BIOT management plan, but also for how we strategize the enforcement strategy moving forward in lieu of not yet having the kind of technological solutions to oversee the reserve as a whole continuously with immediate enforcement.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Now, over to Nelson Island. So I should say the original plan was for the team to be on Danger Island, but ironically it was too dangerous for them to land on it. So yesterday there was a flurry of movement as they dashed to Nelson Island, another important study site. So Nicole, obviously we're talking about recent events of El Niños, but your focus is on sea turtles, which have been around for tens of millions of years, charismatic but threatened animals, and also highly mobile. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research that you've been conducting in the Chagos Archipelago and how that's helping to understand what marine protected areas do for sea turtles and their habitats, of course?
Yes, well, hello everyone. We've been studying hawksbill turtles and green turtles in Biot. Firstly, to carry out an estimation of their population, and we recently were able to document that it's the highest populations in the whole of the Western Indian Ocean here in Biot. So hawksbill turtles are up to 50% of the population across the Western Indian Ocean. So we do that via track surveys across the islands, over 55 islands in Biot. And also we're using satellite tags. So not only are we using FOSSOP GPS Argos satellite tags to study turtles in a nesting habitat, so we attach the tags to female turtles on the beach, but we're also using those tags to study migration patterns and the ultimate foraging sites. And we've been able to publish that turtles are really coming from across the entire Western Indian Ocean, and Biot is a nesting refuge, well protected for turtles from as far as the eastern coast of Africa, and we've shown record-breaking distances, up to 5,000 kilometres for green turtle that went all the way across to Madagascar, and then down the Mozambique Channel, all the way to Mozambique, but also to Somalia, to Kenya, to Madagascar, across the Seychelles, and north to Maldives. And 20% of the green turtle population, we estimate, are staying within Biot, which is excellent news both for protection of breeding turtles as well as foraging turtles in the archipelago. So we're able to show that we can use satellite tracking as a habitat indicator. So we went to visit the areas that those turtles migrated to, just 80 kilometres north of Diego Garcia, which is the largest island in the atoll, in the archipelago. And we found vast areas of seagrass meadows, which are extremely important for marine ecosystems. So what we're doing here now is to stay camping on this island for the next couple of weeks and hopefully find quite a few nesting green turtles. It's peak season now, and so we'll attach faster GPS Argos tags to the turtles after they've nested, release them, and then we'll be able to track those turtles to see whether there's a latitudinal effect on migration patterns in Biot. So hopefully that, in a nutshell, explains what we're doing here today and this couple of weeks.
Thank you, Nicole. I love the sound disruption from the sound of the waves in the background. And there's some lovely sooty terns just showing an appearance behind you there, which is leads me nicely to Malk to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing on seabirds. Now, the archipelago is, as Nicole said, made up of over 50 uninhabited islands. We're looking at 10 important bird areas, and in the context of regional and global declines of seabirds, and them being one of the most vulnerable groups that we're looking at in the marine environment. So I was just wondering if you could tell us why you're on Nelson Island, what research you're doing there, and what insights we're getting into seabird conservation from studying in the British Indian Ocean Territory, or Biot.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to drop one headphone. Thank you, Heather. So you mentioned about the important bird areas. Those are wonderful conservation tools for prioritising the protection of breeding colonies. And you can get some really good information from and studying those breeding colonies and looking at populational trends. And while globally seabirds are the most threatened group, in Biot they're actually doing quite well. And the work we've done to date looking at the status and distribution of these seabirds across multiple islands indicates that for most species the populations are stable or actually increasing. However, while it's easy to actually study seabirds at that breeding colony, it's much, much harder to study how they use their surrounding environment. And to do that, we turn to technology. Much like some of the devices Nicole's been talking about, we use GPS tracking devices, which are this size, rather than that size on a turtle. So this is the ones we mount on birds. And we also use another tiny little device like this, which we put on the legs. Now this device gives us location information about where the birds are going at sea, and this device gives us an indication of when they're on the seawater or when they're on the sea or not. That gives us information on behaviour. So between these two devices, we're able to track breeding seabirds, and here on Nelson Island, we're working on the two species of booby. I'm really hoping one will fly past right now, but it's actually noddies behind us. We're working on red-footed boobies and brown boobies. And we mount this little device under the tail and this one on the leg. And we're tagging the breeding seabirds here on the island. And the information these devices will give us will hopefully identify where the priority foraging grounds are for these breeding species. And very importantly, how those relate to the surrounding marine protected area, whether they're inside it or outside of it. To date, we've only had 2 birds from over 200 that we've tracked that have left the marine protected area while providing for their chicks' nests. But it's quite possible that the marine protected area is actually hugely important for the regional environment. And we say this as it's the largest MPA in the region. And to explore this, we need to understand how important it is for seabirds that breed elsewhere in the region, but undertake non-breeding season migrations, and they may come and use this area. So what we've done is we've got a network of collaborators. We also have some of our other seabird tracking programs in the region, and we're pooling all the tracking data we can from non-breeding seabirds from across the region, and we use that to explore, along with their population level data, how important this MPA is to seabirds elsewhere in the region. So, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm now going to flip to Mauritius and to talk to Professor Nick Graham. Now, typically, reef scientists study reefs and bird scientists study birds. And what's been particularly unusual and valuable about the Bertarelli program in marine science is the collaborative approach and interdisciplinary approach. It would be great if you could explain about how your research in the British Indian Ocean Territory has given some insights into the critical connections between island habitats and reef ecosystems, and why that's so important for management.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I am a coral reef scientist, and I usually study the ecology of coral reef and what's driving the ecology of coral reefs. I've been lucky enough to work out in Biot for going on for nearly 15 years now, and most of my early work was studying the ecology of the reefs and the fish on the reefs. But on those early expeditions, there was always an ornithologist who was studying the bird life on the islands. So I came to realise just how special the islands were for seabirds. You can set foot on an island like the one that Malk and Nicole are on now, and the skies are full, it's noisy, and it really smells. So it may look like they're having a great time right now, but actually when the rain falls, the island's quite pungent with the smell of guano or seabird poo. You can set foot on an island nearby, and there's no seabirds whatsoever. The skies are empty, it's quiet, and it smells great. And the difference is whether there's introduced rats on the islands or not. So some islands have introduced rats, and there's no seabirds because the rats feed on the eggs and won't nest there. Where there's no bird life, and they're raising their young there. As Malk was telling us, these seabirds are flying out away from the islands and away from the reefs to feed, and feeding on small pelagic fish out in the open ocean within and around the territory. And then they come back onto the islands where they nest and they breed and they roost, and they deposit a huge amount of energy or nutrients onto the islands in the form of guano, dead chicks, feathers, and so on. So I became interested in what that might mean for the surrounding coral reefs. So a few years ago, we went out to Biot and we studied 6 islands that had rats present and 6 islands with no rats. And the difference is huge. 750 times more seabirds where there was no rats, and that translated to 250 times more nitrogen being deposited onto those islands. We were able to trace that nitrogen signal from the island out onto the coral reef habitat nearby. And remarkably, those nutrients are tracing all the way out to the coral reef crest, some 250 meters offshore. And the nutrients getting sucked up into the algae, into the sponges, and they're even entering the muscle tissue. You can detect the nitrogen in the muscle tissue of herbivorous fish that are feeding on that algae. Now, fish have ear bones that are called otoliths, and those ear bones lay down growth rings, much like a tree does. So you can quite accurately estimate the age of a fish, and by looking at the length of the fish and its age, you can work out how fast it's been growing. And we showed that the fish adjacent to the island with seabirds were growing faster and were larger for a given age adjacent to the islands with seabirds compared to the islands with rats. We then looked at the overall fish biomass, and that was 50% greater. There's 50% more fish adjacent to the islands with seabirds. And finally, we looked at 2 really important ecosystem processes. So the grazing of algae, which is important for keeping a reef clear and allowing corals to recover after disturbances like coral bleaching, and the production of sediment or sand, which builds the islands themselves. And these 2 processes were 3 to 4 times faster adjacent to islands with seabirds. So the presence of seabirds on these islands, when there's no rats, are enhancing the biomass and the resilience of the reefs and the very islands that those birds are living on.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's obviously showing the impact of some local stresses of invasive species, but I now want to go to Dan, who's been studying the coral reefs and the corals themselves. We also know that even though it's a fully protected marine reserve, that it's not immune to pressures of climate change. And I'd be grateful if you could talk through some of the impacts that climate change has had on the coral reefs in Biot and your research on that and the findings you've made.
Yeah, so I mean, coral reefs are very sensitive to changes in their local environment, and so especially temperature changes, even of a couple of degrees from their normal threshold, will cause them to have this stress mechanism called bleaching. And bleaching is when the symbiotic relationship between corals and the colourful algae that lives within their tissue sort of goes out of balance. And when they're stressed, they get rid of this algae, and because of that, they start not being able to get the nutrients and the food that they get from the algae. And so eventually, if they stay in this stressed state too long, they'll eventually die. And as global oceans have become increasingly hotter, we're starting to see this bleaching on local scales more and more frequently. And then every so often you get these larger scale climate shifts or oscillations, such as Dave has mentioned, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And this causes areas that were normally cooler to rapidly go up in temperature, often for prolonged periods, so a number of months. And this causes wide-scale mortality of corals. And we saw that in 2015 and 2016, so a few years back, across the world. And the Chagos Archipelago was also affected by it. And we actually saw around 2/3 of the shallow reefs, down to around 15-20 meters, were killed off during this period. And that's a huge impact from these global processes on these reefs, which are incredibly important for marine species in terms of habitat and also food. and also in building up and maintaining island structures. And so the research that I've been doing out in the Chagos Island archipelago is developing a new imaging technology called structure from motion photogrammetry, which allows us to visualize and quantify these changes in both complexity, volume, and size of the coral reefs in the reserve. And we've been noticing that over the last 4 years following the bleaching event, that we've actually getting more simplified and flatter reefs, and we're starting to lose some of the volume, which is essential for tracking the rise in sea level. And so it's a very distinct and rapid change in these habitats that are so essential for the fish and other crustacean communities. And it's not all doom and gloom, however. So there has been, over the last year, strong recruitment back onto the reef. So the juvenile baby corals coming back onto the area, and also regrowth of corals that survived through that period. And when this happened on a similar scale in 1998, we saw much more rapid recovery than anywhere else in the Indian Ocean. And so it's signs of hope that if you can remove some of these other impacts other than the global processes through a reserve, such as the British Indian Ocean Territory, then you can actually mitigate some of these damages. And so you have to wait and see how it progresses.
Okay. Well, sticking with the theme of hope, I want to move to Casey and Mauritius. Your paper just out in Global Change Biology, and there are copies of that paper as you leave the theatre if you're interested in picking one up with other materials from the programme. But that paper suggests there may be resilience coming from islands. Can you explain a little bit more about your findings in that paper?
Yeah, so we looked at whether the response of coral reefs to that 2015-2016 mass bleaching event that Dan described depended on whether the reefs were near islands with healthy populations of seabirds or near islands that lack seabirds due to the presence of those introduced rats that Nick discussed. And what we saw is that coral cover declined on those reefs by about a third, and that magnitude of decline did not depend on which island the reefs were near. But what did differ were other groups of benthic organisms. So the empty space that was left behind by the dead corals, when it was around an island with invasive rats, that space pretty much remained bare and empty. But around islands with seabirds, we saw massive increases in two types of calcifying algae. And that took over the bare space left behind by the dying corals. So basically, the nutrients from seabirds fueled about a 5 times increase in algae after this bleaching event. Now, if we move up from the bottom-dwelling organisms to the fish that rely on corals and on coral reefs, we saw that the higher biomass of all fish groups that Nick described actually persisted even despite the bleaching event. So there were declines in some species of fish, especially those that rely heavily on corals, but they still overall benefited from the nutrients from seabirds. And what was really important is that some of those key functional groups, like predators and also like herbivores that are important for grazing, maintained the highest biomass around islands with seabirds. So seabirds really benefited them the most, even in the context of this mass bleaching event in global climate change. So what was really exciting for us about these findings is what they may mean for the resilience of coral reefs in the future. One type of calcifying algae called CCA that really benefited from the seabird nutrients is important for reef accretion budgets. It's an important indicator of ecological function. And also it can help promote the recruitment and also the survival of juvenile corals. So basically, by fueling an increase in CCA after bleaching, seabirds may actually promote a faster recovery of coral reefs. And along the same lines, the higher biomass of herbivores, which was about 200 kilograms per hectare higher on islands with seabirds, That's really important for grazing rates, which may again help quicken the recovery of reefs following bleaching events if they're near an island with seabirds. This is really hopeful to us as well because of the implications for management. So removing invasive rats and restoring seabird populations are relatively easy management objectives to achieve. And our research suggests that the benefits of restoring seabird populations will persist and may actually help increase the resilience of coral reefs in the face of global climate change and macro bleaching events. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, that was a whistle-stop tour from sharks to turtles to reefs and seabirds. I'd now like to see if there's any questions from the audience to any part of the world and any of the scientists here. I think the microphones are... Thank you. Yeah.
My name's Bob Watson. I recently chaired the IPBES Global Assessment on Biodiversity. Very, very interesting work, especially this issue of the seabirds and corals. How resilient do you think the corals would be, even with the nutrients, if we do get 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius sustained change, coupled with ocean acidification, coupled with land-based pollution that we see for most of the major reefs? Do you believe this nutrient can offset a 2.5, 3 degree change and ocean acidification?
It's a similar question.
Okay.
Excuse me, it's a very similar question.
Okay.
Other places in the world, you have the problem of too many nutrients coming from agriculture to land. So, for example, the Great Barrier Reefs, you may have that the bleaching events are worse when you are close to nitrogen loads. So, yes, it's the same question as that. Yeah, it goes together. Thanks.
Okay, Nick and Casey.
Okay, yeah, no, both very relevant and important questions. In terms of climate change, if we head towards 2.5 degrees, then you know, reefs aren't going to cope with that. We're already seeing devastation. Reefs really are on the front line of climate change. They're changing in terms of their composition already. Some places have been devastated and not returned. So reducing carbon emissions and aiming for 1.5 degree warming is critical to any sort of future for coral reefs. But even with that, we're committed to increasingly frequent coral bleaching events. And what's going to be critical is the recovery rate, or the ability of reefs to bounce back between those events, even with vast reductions in emissions. And seabirds nutrients are likely to help with that. And that links to the second question, because nutrients are typically thought of as bad news for coral reefs, and nutrients that are coming off the land, such as in the Great Barrier Reef catchment, are bad news. We actually had a paper this year showing that improving water quality coming from the GBR catchment is the most important thing for increasing recovery rates in the Great Barrier Reef. However, those kinds of nutrients that people put on farmland or are coming out of sewage have a lot of nitrogen in them and very little phosphorus, so they're phosphorus limited. And that's bad news for corals, for their physiology, and for how much temperature stress they can cope with. If nutrients come in a more balanced fashion, so more of a better balance between nitrogen and phosphorus, they actually benefit corals. So lots of lab-based aquarium studies have shown that if you increase nutrient loads, but phosphorus and nitrogen are balanced in that load, corals grow faster and they can cope with higher stress, temperature stress, so they bleach at a higher temperature. There was a really nice study from Fiji that was unrelated to our group recently, where they did a transplant experiment of corals between islands with rats and islands with seabirds. And they showed that the corals that they transplanted to the islands with seabirds were growing 4 times faster than the corals adjacent to the islands with the rats without the seabird nutrient input. So that natural balanced nutrient input can be very beneficial for the growth and the recovery rate of reefs between these bleaching events.
Thank you very much. Dan, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, I think it
Okay.
Nick covered that. But.
Okay, another question here. Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I'm Alison Meston from the International Science Council. The Decade of the Ocean is coming up, and I'm interested to hear from real scientists on the ground, or on the ocean as the case may be. Is our science system equipped? Are we organised enough to make sure that this Decade of the Ocean coming up, that we're getting the right messages to the policymakers to make sure that our ocean is healthy? As an Aussie, I am devastated about my government's lack of innovation and understanding, particularly about the barrier reef. So that's essentially my question. Is our science system strong enough? How do we as an international science community ensure that the research and voices of individual scientists are being heard for this decade coming up?
I'm actually going to pop to Graham, if that's all right, and as he's in Australia and is doing a lot on science to policy. Putting you on the spot here, Graham, but be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. That's a really great question and a really topical question. And we've been having those same thoughts ourselves. How do we maximize the translation of the science we're doing into policy? How do we get that message across? So what we've been doing recently is we've been looking at all the different tracking studies that have been done in the world's oceans. So with seabirds and with turtles, the sort of studies we've heard about today, but also with whales and seals and all sorts of other and all sorts of fish and other creatures. And we've looked at those studies, and we've got a whole community of more than 50 scientists together to say, what were the success stories where that tracking data was able to have a direct impact on conservation policy, whether it was the creation of an MPA or the creation of no fishing zones or whatever it happened to be. And then we distill down how that was achieved, and have then put that out as a paper to fellow scientists to say, these are the key stages you need to go through to maximize the translation of your science into policy. So you're exactly right. We need to maximize the value of all this excellent science. And to go about doing that, what we're doing is we're identifying the best pathways for using that science that's emerging.
Can I add to that slightly? So just to slightly echo what Graham just said, I think monitoring of our natural environment has in the past been something that's sort of gone on behind closed doors and hasn't been particularly available to the general public in terms of how we do it and what the output of that monitoring is. And so I think technology is absolutely crucial and is playing an increasing role in all of our lives. We have much more wearable tech monitoring how systems work, and getting feedback of real data in real time is changing our lives for ourselves, but also allowing people to engage much more with how we monitor the natural world as well. So I think that will play a crucial role going forward as well.
And I would add that this is one reason that a bunch of scientists are here, or virtually here, is that you are a really important audience to share our stories. And I think this is a conversation that we need to have with journalists. What do you need from scientists? How do we get the information to you in the right way? How do we have conversations, and how do we share the data, the stories, the evidence, and the management changes that are needed if we are going to look at delivering what are government commitments. You know, through the Sustainable Development Goals, we have global commitments, but the targets that we're looking at, we're falling well short of. The Paris Agreement is fundamental to saving coral reefs. It's all there, it's all been agreed. It's just meeting those targets that governments have signed up to. So anything that we can do to work more closely with science communicators, with journalists is a really important element for us. Any further questions? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm a journalist from Slovenia. I just wanted to ask, is there any plastic in the middle of the Indian Ocean? Have you seen any?
I'll answer that one because it's an element of the work that we're doing. Unfortunately, yes. Like changing sea surface temperatures, ocean acidification, plastic pollution is global. And we basically find the beaches that you see Nicole and Malk sitting on. And I'm going to hand over to Nicole, actually, because you can talk a little bit about the work that we're doing to look at the impacts of plastics on sea turtles.
Hello. Yes, we find incredible volumes of plastic on the beaches in Biot, even though they're uninhabited beaches. And so what we are doing currently is to study the effects of those plastics on sea turtles. Sea turtles don't have sex chromosomes, and so the temperature at which their eggs are incubating is critical for determining whether hatchlings emerge with a male or with a female. So with increasing temperatures, the sex ratio becomes more female biased. So we're looking at plastics to explore how plastics are going to affect that temperature, as well as the hydration of the eggs, so whether they desiccate the egg chamber as well. And we're sampling pores from across the 5 atolls, the islands and Biot, for microplastics at turtle nesting beaches, as well as looking at macroplastics and using turtles as an iconic species here to influence the behaviour with regard to plastics, in particular single-use plastic bottles, with the slogan of "Say no to that single-use plastic bottle. Why do you need it?" And so we commenced this year with an annual beach clean-up of a remote atoll, Egmont Atoll, to see what the effect of an annual beach clean-up is, as well as looking more specifically at the effects on turtles, and also looking at how we can influence behaviour of people that are residents on Jacoby Island.
Yeah, so just some of the surveys that I did with Nicole earlier this year, and she's been doing in more detail on this particular expedition, have found bottles from over 18 different countries that still have the labels on. We know that these bottles last for well over 500 years. Plastic bottles that float the world's oceans and end up through the oceanographic currents on these uninhabited beaches, and there isn't the infrastructure, there's no population to clean them up. So we're looking at, again, how the science can look at strategic management interventions using in the context of a very remote and isolated place. But it really comes down to all of us not making sure that the plastic doesn't enter the ocean in the first place and impact species like turtles that are really vulnerable to changing incubation temperatures and also ingestion of plastics once they've hatched and enter the ocean. Are there any further questions? One here.
Hello, thank you for this nice panel. I'm Dr. Saray from Ankara, Turkey, doing multidisciplinary research on science communication. I wonder if there are sound captures of sharks or sea turtles or seabirds, and the changing frequencies of their voices or the number of the words like whales show, and in relation with the environmental degradation, if there are some studies done on that. Thank you.
So Malk, the question was on any sound recordings you've taken of seabirds to see if that's changed over time and an indicator of bird population health.
So we've not here. So last year we started to take sound recordings. Was that the question?
Yes, it is. Sound recordings.
Okay, so we started to explore the possibility of using sound recordings here in Biot and some studies elsewhere in the region as a tool for monitoring seabird species composition, but also some metric of abundance, particularly where you have very remote inaccessible islands like this one on here. So while that work has been used elsewhere in the world very effectively for seabirds, it's in its infancy in this region. And it's something we're looking to explore using in the future to monitor seabird abundance and diversity on remote islands.
And we also have some pilot research that we conducted earlier this year looking at the noise of the reefs, led by researchers from Exeter University. We actually have more information on that on our stand downstairs, the Bertarelli Foundation stand downstairs. So we're happy to talk more about that. Just going to, I think there's one last question, as sadly we're running out of time, but...
Hello, Jasmin Appelhans, freelancer from Germany. Coming back to the question of microplastics, there's been a lot of coverage on that in the media. How would you judge the impact of microplastics in contrast to, say, a rise in temperature, a rise in ocean acidification, the influx of nutrients? So how would you say, does that reflect the coverage that is happening at the moment?
Nicole, would you like to answer that one? The question is relating to this sort of threat from microplastics compared to all of the other threats.
I think the critical thing to say is that microplastics are entering our food chain, so they've been documented in fish larvae, in fish, and soon I'm sure we'll be documenting them humans ourselves. So it's critical that we take urgent action to control the volume of plastics that's entering the oceans and start to understand more the effect of microplastics on the food chain and ultimately on health, human health.
I think I would add that in terms of this ecosystem and the global effect on the ocean, that climate change is the number one thing that we need to be worrying about, and cutting emissions and delivering the Paris Agreement is the absolute priority. Plastic has become, it is a very important and significant issue. It's also one that's very relatable, and from our point of view as marine scientists, we're seeing the public engage around the issue of plastics in a way that they haven't before around ocean issues, and that's really important because it opens up the importance of protecting and restoring such an incredible place like this and many other parts of our fantastic ocean world. Right, on that note, I'd like to thank all of the scientists, thank the technology for hanging in there, thank Nicole and Malk for sitting in the baking sun and talking to us, and thank you all for attending this session. Thank you.